Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at First Unitarian Church of Toledo for our virtual broadcast. We hope you all are staying well and safe at home and washing your hands often. Just a couple of announcements today. We want to remind folks that our RE packet was distributed if you're in that Facebook group. And if not, and you have interest in receiving our new RE packet, please contact Soroya King or TK Barger, and we will email you the appropriate resources. Also, if you are interested in performing for our Christmas carols and lessons and carols this winter, this December, and you have a smartphone, want to sing along, contact me at music director at uutoledo.org, and we'll get you included.
"100 years ago, First Unitarian Church of Toledo presented as its Thanksgiving week worship a service in commemoration of the tercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers. Now it's the quatercentenary, and we're using words from that 1920 service today, intentionally going back 100 years for our structure, while my sermon will give some of today's view in its title, Pilgrims in Perspective. Reverend Horace Westwood's sermon at the service last century was The New Puritanism. You might be uncomfortable in hearing some of the readings and prayers in our Thanksgiving service because they're not what our Unitarian Universalism evolved to be, and it's thee and thy Christian language. But it's part of our church history. And it's important for us to make ties to our heritage, even if it's as a way of demonstrating where we were, where we are, and where we might be going. The service in 1920 drew on a commemoration service held almost 2 months earlier, a 300th anniversary commemoration in Plymouth, Massachusetts, celebrated by the International Congress of Religious Liberals. That organization today is known as the International Alliance for Religious Freedom. When it was formed in 1900, it was the International Council of Unitarian and other liberal religious thinkers and workers. The language in First Unitarian's service might have been a bit more tied to Christian tradition than the congregation was, but that could be because of the International Congress commemoration. Don't see our Thanksgiving embrace of past practices as irony, but as recognition of change, as it's us who make our Unitarian Universalist Church, not the Unitarian Universalist Association. Not the UUA being a rigid institution we must contort ourselves into. I'll speak the words from 1920 as heritage of our congregation, not as personal belief. There is a Reverend Westwood quotation, probably not from a Thanksgiving service, in which he said, "Our doctrine of freedom recognizes the authority of neither church, Bible, sacred person, nor tradition, save insofar as this authority confirms the verdict of one's own soul." At the 1920 service, you feel there's still a close association to Bible and tradition. I hope we celebrate this service knowing that the world is better today. We begin with a land acknowledgement, then opening words, followed by a responsive reading. We give thanks for the earth we are on at First Unitarian Church of Toledo and to the people who were here before us. We are thankful to the Miami, Peoria, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which includes the Mohawk, to the Wyandot and the Council of Three Fires, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Delaware, Mingo, and Shawnee people for our presence on what was known to some as the Great Black Swamp. We know that the swamp, which includes where Toledo is now, became United States territory and was settled by white people in large part because of the Battle of Fallen Timbers here in 1794. which enabled U.S. occupation of the Northwest Territory. A year after that battle, Native Americans were sent to live here as part of a treaty with the young United States when the U.S. wanted to take better land where the Native Americans had lived. In 1794, there were not 5,000 people in what would become Ohio. But 25 years later, there were about 500,000, and the U.S. had taken over the Great Black Swamp and exiled the Native Americans, sending them west. So, unwanted land that was said to be too wet to support good community or farming, the Great Black Swamp was developed and became our home. We are grateful that now Greater Toledo is a compassionate region where people of multiple backgrounds and origins live largely in harmony today. Now to our opening words. We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what thou didst in their days, what deeds thou didst in the days of old.
With a strong hand and an outstretched arm, thou didst guide the people across the sea.
When they went from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, thou didst suffer no man to turn them.
Thou didst reprove kings for their sakes.
When they were yet few in number, very few, and strangers in the land.
When they were wandering in the wilderness and found no city to dwell in.
When they were hungry and thirsty, and their souls grew faint within them.
Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of all their distresses.
They remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer.
Thou madest a way for them through deep waters, and didst set their feet in a large place.
The winds heard thy voice and were still, and the waves bore the tempest, tossed to their desired haven.
Thou hast wrought great glory by them through thy power from the beginning, and a little one has become 1,000, and a small one a strong nation.
They inherited the land forever, the branch of thy planting, the work of thy hands, that thou mightest be glorified.
These were noble men and women whose courage and righteousness have not been forgotten, and whose names shall be kept in everlasting remembrance.
Here do we call them blessed.
Great, O Lord, that we, the inheritors of their renown, the heirs of their liberty, may possess the courage and patience and fidelity, and that generations yet unborn may adore thee for thy mercy and desire thee for thy loving kindness.
In our chalice lighting today, I have the opportunity to read number 405, Remembrance of Our Fathers by James Flint from the 1920 service. In pleasant lands have fallen the lines that bound our goodly heritage, and safe beneath our sheltering vines, our youth is blessed and soothed our age. What thanks, O God, to thee are due, that thou didst plant our fathers here and watch and guard them as they grew, a vineyard to the planter dear. The toils they bore our ease have wrought, they sowed in tears and joy we reap. The birthright they so dearly bought, we'll guard till we with them shall sleep. Thy kindness to our fathers shown, in weal and woe through all the past, their grateful sons, O God, shall own, while here their name and race shall last.
Now, for our congregation, we recite our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now we have a time of congregational singing. You congregants at home, we have the hymn, Come Ye Thankful People, number 68.
Come, ye thankful people, come, praise a song of harvest home. Fruit and crops are gathered in, safe before the storms begin. God, our Maker, will provide for our needs to be supplied. Come to God's own temple, come, raise a song of harvest home. Oh, the world is but a field, hidden for a fruitful yield. Wheat and tares together sown, here for joy our sorrows grown. First the blade and then the ear, then the full corn shall appear. God of harvest, grant that we, wholesome, green, and pure may be.
Good morning. I have the opportunity to bring the story within your hearing today, and it's called When You Have More Than Enough by Dawn Star Sarah Sportschelt, who is a Unitarian Universalist minister as well as a religious educator. Once upon a time, there was a family. Maybe this family had not quite enough to eat, or maybe they had just about enough, or perhaps they had more than enough. You might not have been able to tell. They might not have been able to tell. Maybe it's hard to tell if you have enough or not. It's hard not to want more or different things than you have. In any case, this family came together one autumn day for a celebration, a feast, a time of gratitude. They gathered, as we have done, around a table. There was food, there was drink, there were flowers to remind them of beauty. And then there was a call from the gate outside their door. Hello, we're hungry and thirsty, and we see you have a feast. May we come in? Well, the family didn't know at first how to answer. Who were these people at the gate? Was it safe to let these people in? Did they have enough to share? Was there room? But they remembered. They remembered that most of them have come to this family, to this celebration from someplace else. They remembered that even they who were there at that table had not always been kind to each other. There had been times when they hurt each other. There were times when they made each other sad or angry or afraid. There is no way to make life completely safe. They remembered times when others had shared with them, even when others might not have had quite enough of their own. They remembered when each new member of the family had been born or come to stay or married in. They remembered that they had always found a way to make room. And they remembered an old saying, when you have more than you need, it is better to build a longer table than a higher fence. We have enough, they said. We might have more than enough. We are many and strong, and we can hold a safe space here in our home for all who come. And so they went out of their door and to the gate In the fence, they opened the gate. They invited the people who were there in. Inside, they pulled out another table and made the space for these newcomers. They covered it with a cloth, and the newcomers set upon it a dish full of something fragrant and delicious, which was strange and wonderful to the family. Everybody shared, and there was enough. I want us to notice that we only heard one part of that story. We heard the story of the people who were in the family in the house ready to feast. We didn't hear the story of the people at the gate wanting to come in. We don't know who they were or why they were there or what they bring to the table other than the strange and wonderful food. So when you hear stories this Thanksgiving season, I want you to think about those whose stories they are and whose stories they aren't, and what those other stories might have been.
It's anthem time. Well, we had one scheduled with our virtual choir. There are some challenges to presenting that video today. So instead, we have our music director, Mickey Emsch, giving us Let Us Break Bread Together with Bonnie Rowe as accompanist.
Let us break bread together on our knees. Let us break bread together on our knees. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, oh Lord, have mercy on me. Let us give thanks together on our knees. Let us give thanks together on our knees. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, oh Lord, have mercy on me.
Now, please join me for a time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer. We think of our joys and sorrows, of celebrations, of pain, of sadness. And we try to be in community, even in isolation, doing what we can to support one another. Today, I bring you this prayer from the 1920 service. O God, the ruler of every nation and the Father of us all, we thank thee for thy guidance, which brought the pilgrims to this land. We thank thee that they laid in thy name the foundations of their state. In the compact which they framed, we hear not their words alone, but thy voice speaking in their hearts. We thank thee not only that they created a government of the people, but that, knowing that liberty is powerless without loyalty, they solemnly pledged obedience to the laws which they themselves should make. For their principles, which have spread from ocean to ocean and far beyond this land, we give thee our thanks. And to those principles, to our country, and to thee, our God, we pledge anew our loyalty. Amen. And now let's observe 1 minute of silence. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
I will read in your hearing the Pilgrim Compact from the 1920 service. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness thereof, whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. The minister then said, "The Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers." The congregation responded, "That he may incline our hearts unto him, to keep his commandments and to walk in his ways."
For our service at First Unitarian Church of Toledo 100 years ago, though it had the long title, A Service in Commemoration of the Tercentenary of the Landing of the Pilgrim Fathers, the sermon given by Reverend Horace Westwood was titled The New Puritanism. So while I gave the service a centennial update with a service in commemoration of the quatercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers, we can have a shorter title for my sermon and call it Pilgrims in Perspective. I don't know what Reverend Westwood's approach was to the new Puritanism at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, but I wonder if he could have included words trying to address the positives of living in community inspired by intentions of these separatists from 1620 crossing an ocean to build what they hoped would be beloved community. More likely, what with prohibition having started in January of 1920, he was talking about the experience of free expression being limited by people trying to impose their own ideas of what is right and not respecting others to make their own choices. Much like we see today with people trying to turn the clock back and legislate restrictions on who can marry, to deny women having control over their own bodies, and to restrict common human rights. There will probably always be a Puritan strain in American society, but people change and they change society. We don't view Thanksgiving like Americans did 100 years ago, do we? We've grown more conscious that, yes, the people who lived on this continent when Europeans arrived had their own nations and were civilized. And it's rare to hear the term Pilgrim Fathers. In 2020, 400 years after the 1620 landing of what were called the Pilgrim Fathers at Plymouth Rock on Cape Cod of what is now Massachusetts, though their intended destination was Virginia, we're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, and our way of community this year has become primarily through electronic connection rather than in person, because COVID-19 has characteristics to spread throughout an assembly of people. But it's also Thanksgiving, an annual national holiday, and a time when we think of pilgrims and Puritans, of people coming to a land new to them to form their vision of a new kind of civilization. 100 years ago, it seems that the attitude of Americans, some of us descendants of those pilgrims and Puritans, was that the people already resident here were happy to provide land to the newcomers and to assist the new neighbors in learning how to make the land work for them with good practices in agriculture. And there was a solid acceptance that the white settlers possessed supremacy and their Christianity gave them dominion over the world, including people who didn't know about Jesus. Today, we have more of an idea that, yes, the colonizers were displacing communities and imposing their own society rather than adapting to and melding with the people whose land they moved near or on. The First Nations people were expected to adapt to European ways, not to live their own lives and adjust with the newcomers to form a common society for all. I note that the Pilgrims and the Puritans were different groups. We put them together, especially at Thanksgiving time, but there's some difference of belief and of their path from England to what was called the New World. The Plymouth colonizers were pilgrims, not using that term at the time, but rather separatists. I think both Pilgrims and Puritans, soon after the Mayflower, Puritans arrived and settled close by, used the term saints too, for their assumptions of having religious favor. Let me read from a distinction between Puritans and Pilgrims that I found in a little book from 2005 called A Theological Miscellany by T.J. McTavish. The Puritans were a reformed party within the Church of England in the 16th to 17th centuries. They sought to restructure and renew the church according to biblical principles. They did not leave the established church, but considered themselves the purified Church of England. The separatists, on the other hand, left the established church and formed their own groups in order to worship according to biblical standards. Because England did not tolerate religious diversity, many separatists lived in Holland. The settlers of the Plymouth Colony in 1620 were separatists. In the 19th century, they began to be called the Pilgrims, but originally they were simply the first comers. A larger group of Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in nearby Salem and Boston in 1630. The two groups differed in their concept of the church, but otherwise had a similar theology and worship. Eventually, the two colonies were merged into Massachusetts, and people came to think of all of them as Puritans. American Unitarianism has its roots in New England churches, the separatist Pilgrims, and then the more general Puritan not being limited just to continuing Church of England membership. They were Congregationalists, their Calvinism being state-sponsored religion, according to what was called the Standing Order. And Unitarian congregations broke away from the Congregationalists, often reorienting the existing churches, and then made efforts to have their Unitarian independence recognized by the state. That is tied to the word anti-disestablishmentarianism, which you might have learned as a kid just because it's a long word. Basically, that's tied to a court case in 1820, Dedham, Massachusetts. So that's 200 years after the time, 400 years ago, that we're focused on today. Back to the 1620s and more of a traditional Pilgrim perspective. Here is an excerpt from a sermon in Plymouth, New England, December 1621, given by Robert Cushman, a pilgrim who was a leader and organizer for the Mayflower voyage, but who didn't cross the ocean on that ship, instead arriving on the Fortune in 1621. The Mayflower Pilgrims had returned to England from Holland so they could have the king's support in establishing their New England. From Cushman's sermon. And who so rightly considereth what manner of entrance, abiding, and proceedings we have had amongst these poor heathens since we came hither, will easily think that God hath some great work to do towards them. They were wont to be the most cruelest and treacherousest people in all these parts, even like lions. But to us, they have been like lambs, so kind, so submissive and trusty, as a man may truly say many Christians are not so kind nor sincere. They are very much wasted of late by reason of a great mortality that fell amongst them 3 years since, which together with their own civil dissensions and bloody wars hath so wasted them, as I think the 20th person is scarce left alive. And those that are left have their courage much abated, and their countenance is defected, and they seem as a people affrighted. I'm seeing some illness parallels from what's said to be their plague to today's pandemic, and I hope we will do better and won't have colonizers coming. Cushman continues the introductory part of his sermon. And though when we came first into the country, we were few, and many of us were sick, and many died by reason of the cold and wet, it being the depth of winter, and we having no houses nor shelter, yet when there was not 6 able persons among us, and that they came daily to us by hundreds with their sachems or kings, and might in 1 hour have made a dispatch of us, yet such a fear was upon them as that they never offered us the least injury in word or deed. And by reason of one Tisquanto that lives amongst us that can speak English, we have daily commerce with their kings, and can know what is done or intended towards us amongst the savages. Also, we can acquaint them with our courses and purposes, both humane and religious. And the greatest commander of the country, called Massasoit, cometh often to visit us, though he live 50 miles from us, and often sends us presents, he having with many other of their governors promised, yes, subscribed obedience to our sovereign Lord King James, and for his cause to spend both strength and life. And we, for our parts, through God's grace, have with that equity, justice, and compassion carried ourselves toward them, as that they have received much favor, help, and aid from us, but never the least injury or wrong by us. We found the place where we live empty, the people being all dead and gone away. That was the plague, historians say. And none living nearby 8 or 10 miles. And though in the time of some hardship we found traveling abroad some 8 bushels of corn hid up in a cave, and knew no owners of it, yet afterward, hearing of the owners of it, we gave them, in our estimation, double the value of it. Our care also hath been to maintain peace amongst them, and have always set ourselves against such of them as used any rebellion or treachery against their governors, and not only threatened such, but in some sort paid them their due deserts. And when any of them are in want, as often they are in the winter, when their corn is done, we supply them to our power, and have them in our houses eating and drinking and warming themselves, which thing, though it be something a trouble to us, yet because they should see and take knowledge of our labors, orders, and diligence, both for this life and a better, we are content to bear it. And we find in many of them, especially of the younger sort, such a tractable disposition, both to religion and humanity, as that if we had means to apparel them and wholly to retain them with us, as their desire is, they would doubtless in time prove serviceable to God and man. And if ever God send us means, we will bring up hundreds of their children, both in labor and learning. And we get to Pilgrims in Perspective. Now we see good intentions by Cushman's people, but we also see that there's something lacking in respecting the inherent worth and dignity in who they called the savages, that they can be good if they take up the ways of the pilgrims, not continue their own worldview. We've started to raise questions about the attitude of Cushman and so many who came after. The presumption of, weren't they nice to make room for us? And when we found there were owners of what we took, we paid what we think is double the worth, as if commerce will fix it. The Doctrine of Discovery dates to 1493 and was a papal bull. So there's some remove, but really only a little bit, between it and the colonization of New England. The Doctrine of Discovery is what established essentially the idea that land is open to the taking by Christians if the people on the land don't know about Jesus and haven't been converted to Christianity. The doctrine still seems to apply to New England and British colonization in the way that Christians arrived and settled in areas where other people with their own religions lived. Remember that the Mayflower Compact, which Sorolla recited, had as its first listed priority the voyage to plant a colony being for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. The Mayflower Compact and Cushman's words get to so much of today's reconsideration of what many of us took for granted as the American way. The newcomers even brought the name America. It's hard to read the compact without perspective of the way we've changed. That now we recognize the indigenous people had civilization and society. It's especially hard for those of us who live lives advocating compassion in community, and that ancestral immigration is more than a shared meal at harvest time where we cook food that the people already here showed us how to grow and probably cook for much better meals than we attempt. And the enslavement of Africans and their being transported to the area was beginning at the same time. In our own better nation, despite actions that government attempts at times, we welcome and make room for immigrants to our communities, perhaps recognizing that the colonizer models our forebears used weren't the best ways. And this year, we'll give thanks differently, with more intimacy rather than in a crowd. May the harvest celebration nourish us to the health we need to minimize and eventually be able to resist COVID-19. This is a different Thanksgiving time for all of us. We won't have large family gatherings that illustrate a coming together. The community meals will mostly be distributing a meal package to go rather than a sit-down feast. The people truly in need of meals and company will have less possibility of company and will have a different approach to the meal. And this year, add to the people in need many, many new families that have been lining up around blocks for food distribution. The Pilgrims did have a vision of community. We can continue that, but it's not the same vision. We might do better if it's for the truth of the golden rule rather than for glory of divinity, for faith in one another rather than dependence on providence. We can learn from the past and be grateful for that past in all its complexity and complications. We can honor pilgrims and Puritans, separatists, saints, and have the perspective that our world has grown from the world when they lived. Let's be in community in all its best senses. We can remember that 400 years ago, new people arrived on this continent and met people who were struggling against devastating illness. We're sick again. Let's recognize that it's in community that we can make the world better and its people, us, healthy. And that we have the science to do so with vaccines and not have to make the mortal sacrifices that herd immunity requires. We're not a herd of humans, after all, but people together, and isolating to preserve a future of togetherness. Be thankful, be grateful, be kind. So be it.
For our offering today, I have words from the 1920 Order of Service. The work of the Society is supported financially by the voluntary contributions of its friends and members through regular subscriptions and Sunday offerings. It is urged that all those are interested subscribe as generously as possible, that the work may proceed without financial handicap. Come a little bit differently in the past 100 years, so if you'd like to click the link in the YouTube comments, you can donate on our website at uutoledo.org, or if you prefer a more standard passing of the plate, you might send that to our Glendale address. Thank you, as always, for your continued support of our mission.
And each week we give a coming soon, a preview. Next week's 10 a.m. Spiritual Adventures Forum is going to have presenter Aaliyah White leading a roundtable sharing of fifth week poetry. So you might bring your poetry to another informal roundtable where everyone can come prepared to share a few of their favorite poems, which can be either your own or those of famous poets. The sky is the limit, Aaliyah says. It's relaxing and very fun. And then for our 11 a.m. service, our student minister, Melissa Jeter, will be preaching on thinking shepherds, pilgrims, and the late bronze.
Immediately after today's service, we'll have our Zoom social hour. Instead of our usual coffee time with snacks in Fellowship Hall, we invite you to join us from the comfort and safety of your home, and a special invitation to those who are visiting our virtual broadcast. You can find the Zoom meeting code and password on the screen or in your order of service.
For our closing words, this was sung as a hymn in the 1920 service. You probably know it fairly well, at least the first verse. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet whose stern, impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. O beautiful for glorious tale of liberating strife, when valiantly for man's avail men lavished precious life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine. O beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam undimmed by human tears. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
As we extinguish the flame today, we have these words by John Pierpont, Our Fathers, that was taken from the 1920 service. Gone are those great and good who here in peril stood and raised their hymn. Peace to the revered dead, the light that won their head the passing years have shed shall ne'er grow dim. Ye temples that to God rise where our fathers trod, guard well your trust. The faith that dared the sea, the truth that made them free, their cherished purity, their garnered dust. Thou high and holy one, whose care for sire and son all nature feels, while day shall break and close, while night her crescent shows. O let thy light repose on these hills.